I'll write this as continuous prose for voice narration, following the structural beats, while maintaining the intimate, restrained voice throughout. I keep a clear macro loop. Who framed her? Why did the king nearly let it happen? Running from the cold, open through the climax, a midpoint reversal that breaks the Dravon wanted her dead assumption, and an ending where she's chosen freely. The bond severed, the choice remaining. I was close enough to see her hands. That's what I tell people now when they ask. Not the blade. Her hands. They didn't shake. I'd been paid to stand in the second row, same as everyone else paid to fill out a crowd that morning. And I remember thinking, a woman who's about to die should have shaking hands. Hers were folded in front of her like she was waiting for tea to steep. The frost hadn't melted off the cobblestones yet. Her bare feet stood in it like she didn't feel cold anymore, like the cold had given up on her the way everyone else had. The executioner's name was Bram Austell, and he had a notch in his left ear, old scar tissue from a dog bite no one ever asked about. I remember that because I kept looking at his ear instead of his axe. The Alpha King stood on the platform in furs the color of wet slate, and his jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. He said her name, Rosalind. Not loud, almost gentle, the kind of gentle that scares you more than shouting would. Then he said, "Proceed." I watched the axe go up. I watched it come down to nothing, because his hand closed around the blade an inch from her throat, and the blood came fast and red down his wrist, dripping onto the frost at her feet, and he didn't even flinch. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. He didn't flinch. He looked at his own palm split open like it belonged to someone else, and then he looked at her, and the whole square went so quiet I could hear the rope creak where they'd tied her wrists. I don't know what passed between them. I only know the sound he made wasn't a king's sound. It was lower than that, older than that. It came from somewhere underneath the crown. The frost had been on the ground 3 days before that morning, hard and unmelting, the kind that makes a courtyard sound different under boots. Sharper, more honest, every footstep its own small confession. Rosalind had counted 211 of them on the walk from the cell to the block, because counting kept her from screaming, and screaming was the one thing she had promised herself she would not do. Not for the crowd, not for the men who'd lied, not even for him. She had a thin white scar along her left collarbone, shaped like a fishhook, old enough that she'd stopped noticing it years ago. Tonight she noticed everything. The scar burned faintly in the cold, the way old wounds sometimes do, as if her body remembered every other time it had been marked and was keeping count alongside her. 3 days earlier, she had been the king's translator. Not his lover, not his confidant, a woman with a gift for dead languages and a habit of staying in rooms after she'd been dismissed, listening past the door because listening had kept her alive, since she was 11 years old and her own pack burned. 3 days earlier, a letter had been found in her chest of drawers, sealed with a signet that wasn't hers, addressed to a rival Alpha, promising troop movements that would get 400 wolves killed in a valley, 2 days' ride from the capital. She had never written it. She had never seen it before the moment it was placed in her hands by a guard. With a missing front tooth, his gap-toothed smile the only memorable thing about him, who told her to hold still while the magistrate looked her over for tremor, for guilt, for anything that would make the lie easier to believe. Her hands had not trembled then either. People mistook that for innocence. It was something colder. It was the particular stillness of a woman who had learned, a long time ago, that panic was a luxury afforded only to people who expected to be saved. She did not expect to be saved. That was the thing she would have to unlearn. The court convened in the long hall, 2 hours after the letter surfaced, and Rosalind stood at the center of it in the same gray dress she'd worn to translate treaties the week before, as if the fabric itself hadn't been told yet what was happening to the woman wearing it. Lord Caldervess sat closest to the dais. He had a missing left eyebrow, burned off in a border skirmish a decade back, and it gave his face a permanent look of mild surprise that didn't match anything he ever said. He said, "This woman has sold us to the Korath pack." He said it like he was reading a grocery list. "I haven't," Rosalind said. "Short, flat." She would not give them tears. "The seal is the Korath sigil," Vess said. "Found in your possession." "Found," she repeated. "By whom?" A murmur went through the hall. The particular murmur of people enjoying a thing they would later claim to have been horrified by. Dravan sat above all of it, on a chair too plain to be called a throne, though everyone called it one anyway. He had not spoken since the proceedings opened. His eyes, she would remember this later, turn it over and over like a coin she couldn't decide was counterfeit. His eyes had not left her once, not even when Vess produced the letter and read it aloud in a voice built for theater. "Your Grace," Rosalind said, and it cost her something to say it, after 6 years of court but never once needing to beg. "I have served this pack since I was 19. I have translated every treaty that kept us out of 3 wars. I have never." "The evidence is the evidence," Vess said. "The evidence is convenient," she said. That earned a silence sharp enough to cut. She watched Dravan's jaw move, the muscle there working like he was biting down on words he didn't trust himself to release. "Take her to holding," he said finally, "until I have reviewed this myself." It should have sounded like mercy. It didn't. Mercy has warmth in it, and his voice that day had none. Flat as a door closing, final as a held breath. That night in the cell, she heard 2 guards talking outside her door, low, the way men talk when they think a condemned woman is too broken to listen. One of them had a voice that cracked on certain consonants, a permanent rasp from old smoke inhalation, and she would remember that rasp longer than she remembered his face. "King wants it done quiet," he said. "Quick trial, quick block. Before the Korath envoys arrive. Why's he care how quick? Don't ask me. Vess says the king's known her too long. Says it's not right. A man judging a woman he spent 6 years passing notes to in 3 dead languages." A pause. The creak of a guard shifting his weight. "You think he'll spare her?" "I think," the rasping one said, "that if he does, half this court will say he spared her because he's betting her, and the other half will say he should have spared her sooner. Either way he loses. King can't win this one. Best thing for him is to let the axe do the talking and never explain himself to anyone." Rosalind sat very still on the cold stone, knees drawn to her chest, and understood for the first time that her death might not be about her at all. It might simply be the cheapest way out of a problem that had nothing to do with guilt. She did not cry. She catalogued, instead, the sound of dripping water somewhere down the corridor, counting the intervals between drops because counting was the only language fear had ever let her keep. The reprieve, when it came wrong. 3 days into her confinement, Dravan entered her cell alone, which violated 4 separate protocols she'd translated into law herself, and stood in the doorway long enough that she finished counting the seams in the stone before he spoke. "I'm staying the execution," he said, pending further review. No relief came. She'd expected relief, somewhere in the animal part of her chest, and instead felt only a colder calculation settling into place. "For how long?" she said. "As long as I need." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She studied him in the low light. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, shadows pooled beneath eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow. He had, she noticed it now, for the first time really seeing him as something other than her king. A thin white line through his left eyebrow, old and faded, a scar she'd never asked about in 6 years, because asking a king about his scars was a kind of intimacy she'd never let herself claim. "They'll say you spared me because of what's between us," she said. "There's nothing between us." It came too fast, too flat. The kind of denial that sounds rehearsed, because it's been said before, silently, 100 times, to an audience of one. "Then you've made it worse," Rosalind said. A king who stays in execution for no reason looks like a king controlled by something. Better I'd died this morning. At least then the rot would have been buried with me. Something crossed his face, not anger, something closer to pain wearing anger's clothes. And then it was gone, folded away the way he folded away everything. "You're welcome," he said, "for your life," and the bitterness in it surprised her more than the words themselves. "I didn't ask you to save it." "No," he said, "you didn't." He left without another word, and she sat alone in the dark, turning his face over in her mind like a coin. She couldn't read both sides of at once. Word of the stay spread through the keep by morning, and Rosalind learned within a day that the rasping guard had been right about one thing. There was no version of this where she came out safe. The half of the court that had wanted her dead for treason now wanted her dead for proof. Proof that the king hadn't been compromised. Proof that the throne still answered to law and not to whatever softness had stayed his hand. The half that had doubted her guilt now wanted her silent. Because a living woman who might be innocent was a far more dangerous thing to certain people than a dead one who couldn't speak at all. Lord Vess visited her cell on the second day of her reprieve, alone, his absent eyebrow giving him that same look of permanent mild surprise even as he said something that should have required a different face entirely. "You should have died Tuesday," he said. "It would have been cleaner. For you, for everyone." He crouched, bringing his face level with hers through the bars, close enough she could smell the cedar oil in his collar. The king's reprieve has cost him 3 allies already. The Korath envoys arrive in 9 days expecting a corpse and a closed matter. Instead, they'll find a live woman and an open question. And questions, Rosalind, are how wars start. Then let me answer the question. Let me speak before the court. Let someone find the man who actually forged that seal. Vess's mouth curved, not quite a smile. There is no man to find. There's only what's convenient, and what's convenient is you. In the ground before the envoys arrive. He left her with that, and she sat with her back against cold stone, hands folded the way they'd folded at the block, and understood that the reprieve hadn't saved her at all. It had only changed the shape of the danger, sharpened it into something with more patience. That night she dreamed of fire. Not the fire that had taken her first pack when she was 11, but a different fire, gold-eyed, close enough to feel its heat against her throat. She woke with her pulse loud in her ears and no memory of why. Dravon did not sleep that week. He told himself it was the matter of evidence, the matter of a treaty at risk, the matter of 9 days, until the Korath envoys arrived expecting either a corpse or an explanation. And he had neither to give them. He told himself a great many things that week. His beta, a broad-shouldered man named Joran Pelt with a missing left thumb, lost to a trapline decades back, the kind of injury that never stopped aching in the cold, found him in the war room past midnight, staring at the same letter Vess had read aloud in court, turning it over like the paper might confess something the ink hadn't. "You're not sleeping," Joran said. "I'm working. You're staring at a piece of parchment you've already read 40 times. Dravon set it down. His jaw worked. The seal's wrong. Wrong how? Korath sigils carry the wolf facing east. This faces west. He pushed the letter across the table. It's a forger's mistake. Someone who's seen the sigil but never held the original seal in their hand. Joran studied it, then studied Dravon longer. You've known this since the trial. I suspected it since the trial. And you said nothing. Dravon's silence answered for him. Why, Joran said, quieter now, the kind of quiet that came from 20 years of friendship and not fear of his king. Because if I said it in that hall, every man in it would have heard a king defending the woman he stopped. Started again. There was no clean way to say it. There's no clean way to almost let an innocent woman die either. The words landed harder than Joran probably meant them to. Dravon's hand closed slowly into a fist on the table, and for a moment the room held nothing but the sound of the fire in the hearth, snapping low, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. "I know," Dravon said finally. "I know what I almost did." He did not say why he had almost let it happen anyway. He did not yet have words for the thing that had kept him silent in that hall. The old, animal terror that, speaking her name with any warmth in his voice, would hand his enemies a blade sharper than the one already raised above her throat. She was brought before him again on the 5th day of her reprieve, this time not in a cell but in his private study, and the difference in setting did nothing to soften the difference in what they both knew was at stake. "I found the flaw in the seal," he said, without preamble. "It's forged, badly." Something in her chest loosened, fractionally, the way a held breath loosens before it's fully released. "Then clear me, publicly, today. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." Her voice rose, the first time in days she'd let it. "You have proof. Use it. If I stand before that court and announce the evidence against you was forged, every eye in the room turns to ask who forged it, and the answer that satisfies them fastest is the answer that costs you most." He moved closer, close enough that she caught the low, cedar and iron scent of him, and her body responded to it before her mind had decided whether to trust it. "Vess has allies I haven't traced yet. If I move too soon, I expose you to people I can't yet name. So I stay condemned, indefinitely, for my own protection." "Yes, that's not protection," she said. "That's a longer execution." He flinched at that, actually flinched, a small contraction at the corner of his eye, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire popped in the hearth. Somewhere below them, in the keep's lower halls, a door closed, ordinary and far away. "I won't let them have you," he said low. "You already did. Once, on a platform with an axe in the air." His hand found the edge of the desk between them, knuckles paling. "I stopped it, at the last second." She held his gaze, refusing to look away first, the way she'd refused at the block. "Tell me why you waited that long." He didn't answer. The silence stretched, taut as the rope that had bound her wrists 3 days before, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the axe had, that the answer existed, that he knew it, that he was choosing right now, in front of her, not to say it. "You should go," he said finally, "before someone sees you here." She went. But she carried the unanswered question with her down every cold corridor back to her cell, turning it over the way she'd once turned over treaty clauses, looking for the seam where the meaning hid. The proximity became a kind of architecture neither of them named. He found reasons to summon her, a treaty clause that needed translating, a Korath dialect, only she could parse cleanly, reasons thin enough that even the guards exchanged glances when she was called for a 4th time in 6 days. She came because refusing would have looked like guilt, and because some smaller, more honest part of her wanted to. They sat across a table on the 7th day, parchment between them, and his hand reached for the same line of text hers had just touched, and for half a second their fingers rested an inch apart on the page, neither one moving for 3 full breaths. "This phrase," she said, too fast, pulling her hand back first. "It's an old border dialect. It means, the debt remembers the debtor. It's a threat disguised as a proverb. Most good threats are." His voice had gone rougher than the sentence required. She looked up. He was already looking at her, not at the parchment, not at the threat disguised as proverb, at her, and something in his expression made her pulse trip over itself before she could stop it. "You're staring," she said. "I'm aware. It's not appropriate." "No," he agreed, and didn't look away. She broke first. She always broke first, lately, in these small contests that weren't supposed to be contests at all. And she hated how much that unsettled her, how much more dangerous this felt than the axe had. That night, alone in her cell, she pressed her palm flat against her own sternum, and felt her heart going faster than the silence around her should have allowed, and told herself it was fear. It had stopped, somewhere in the last week, entirely being fear. The 9th day arrived with frost still thick on the ground, and with it the Korath envoys. 3 riders in dark leather, led by a woman named Sela Korath, who had a single streak of white through otherwise black hair, said to have come the night her own brother died in a border skirmish years before. She rode into the courtyard expecting, by every account she'd received, a closed matter and a buried traitor. She found instead a court split down its middle, and a king who would not meet anyone's eyes for more than a breath at a time. "Where is the woman who betrayed my pack's confidence to your enemies?" Sela asked, dismounting without ceremony, voice carrying easily across the frozen yard. "There was no betrayal," Dravan said. "The evidence against her was forged." A ripple went through the assembled court, Vess's mild surprise face going, for the first time, genuinely surprised, and Sela's dark eyes narrowed. "Forged by whom?" "That," Dravan said, "is what I intend to learn." It was not enough. Rosalind watched from the edge of the yard, flanked by 2 guards who hadn't been told yet whether she was prisoner or guest, and understood that the king's half-answer had bought her nothing but more time inside the same danger. Sela's people had ridden 2 days expecting closure. They would not leave without it, and the court's appetite for a scapegoat had not lessened, only redirected, hungrier now for someone to blame for the delay Yell itself. That night, someone tried to kill her. She woke to the smell of tallow smoke and the wrongness of her cell door already open, a shape at the foot of her cot too solid to be shadow. She didn't scream. Screaming was still the one thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. She rolled. The blade meant for her throat, catching her shoulder instead, white pain blooming hot and immediate, and she was on her feet and through the door before the second strike landed, blood slicking warm down her arm, bare feet slapping cold stone, running toward the one place in the keep she knew would still have a light burning. She didn't choose to run to him. Her body chose it before she had a vote. He was at his desk when she burst through the door, parchment forgotten the instant he saw her. The blood, the torn sleeve, the wild white of her eyes, and he was across the room before she'd finished saying his name. "Who?" he said. Just that, one word, and his voice had dropped into something she'd never heard from him before. Low and rough and entirely without the careful control he wore like armor. "I don't know." He didn't speak. His hands found her shoulders, careful even in his urgency, and the wound beneath his palm made her flinch, and he flinched harder, as if her pain had passed directly into him. "Let me see." "It's shallow. Let me see, Rosalind." She let him. He peeled back the torn fabric with hands that shook. Actually shook, the first unsteadiness she'd ever seen from him, and the cut beneath was an inch deep, ugly, already slowing its bleed. He pressed a cloth to it, and the contact, skin to skin, sent something through her that had nothing to do with pain at all. "This is what protecting you looks like," he said, quiet, furious, the words aimed as much at himself as at her. "I've kept you condemned and called it safety. I'm aware. I should have ended this the moment I suspected the seal was forged. Why didn't you?" He didn't answer. Again. The same silence she'd pressed against twice now, and this time, with her blood still on his hands, she refused to let it stand. "Tell me," she said. "Whatever it is you won't say. I have a knife wound and an empty cell, and 9 more days of this court deciding whether I live, and I am done being protected by a man who won't tell me what he's protecting me from." His jaw worked, twice. The cloth pressed to her shoulder, his thumb resting just above the wound, not quite touching, close enough that the warmth of his hand bled into her skin anyway. "From me," he said finally. "I'm protecting you from what happens if I admit, in front of that court, why I really stopped that axe." The fire cracked low in the hearth. Neither of them moved. "Why did you stop it?" she said, and this time it wasn't a question she was willing to let him swallow. He told her, in pieces, the way men tell the truth when they've spent too long not telling it. He told her that the moment the blade had been an inch from her throat, something in his chest had torn loose, that had nothing to do with kingship, nothing to do with law, nothing to do with the careful distance he'd kept between them for 6 years out of duty and fear in equal measure. He told her his wolf had not asked his permission. "There's a bond," he said. "A scent bond. It forms once, sometimes, between a wolf and the person he's meant for, and it doesn't ask the man wearing the crown whether the timings is convenient." His hand had gone still on her shoulder, cloth forgotten. "I felt it the first week you came to court. I told myself it was nothing. I buried it under 6 years of treaties and meetings, and every reason a king has to never want what he wants. And at the block, the bond didn't care what I'd buried. It surfaced the second the blade was close enough to take you from me, and it wasn't a choice. My hand moved before my mind caught up to it." Rosalind sat very still. The cold cloth pressed to her shoulder, the warmth of his palm beneath it, and felt the floor of everything she'd believed about that morning tilt sideways. She had thought all this time that mercy had stayed his hand, some flicker of doubt, of justice, of a king remembering what he owed the law. It hadn't been mercy at all. It had been instinct, animal, older than any crown, older than any law he'd ever signed his name to, and it meant the man who had ordered her execution and the man who had stopped it were, in some terrible, unbearable way, not even fully the same person making 2 different choices. They were one creature, split by a leash he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it was there until it snapped. "You let it get that far," she said slowly, "knowing what you felt." "I didn't know, not consciously, not until the wolf made the decision for me." "That's not better, Draven, that's worse." Her voice had gone hard, the shock curdling fast into something closer to fury. "You almost let me die rather than admit you wanted me. Bond or no bond, you knew something was wrong with that evidence before the platform. And you let it go forward anyway, because admitting otherwise would have cost you something." He didn't defend himself. That, more than anything he might have said, was what kept her in the room instead of walking out. "Yes," he said, "I did. The days after that confession moved differently. Not safer, if anything, more dangerous, because now there were 2 truths loose in the keep instead of one, and either could kill her, depending on who learned it first. That the evidence against her was forged, and that the king had a bond he hadn't chosen and couldn't unmake." Vess noticed the shift before anyone else did. He always did. "You've been in his private study 4 times this week," he said, cornering her in a stone corridor, too narrow for her to walk past him without making it a confrontation. "People are starting to ask the question I asked from the start, whether the king's judgment can be trusted where you're concerned. My judgment isn't on trial. His is." "His judgment," Vess said, voice dropping, "nearly got an innocent woman's head off a platform. And if what I suspect is true, if there's more between you than treaty translation, then his judgment is compromised in exactly the way that gets 400 wolves killed in a valley, Rosalind. Not by your hand, by his heart." It struck closer to true than she wanted to admit. She thought of Joran's missing thumb, of the rasping guard's warning the first night in her cell. King can't win this one, and felt, for the first time, the full architecture of the trap she and Draven were both standing inside. "Find who forged the seal," she said. "If you want the truth so badly, find the man who actually betrayed this pack, instead of cornering the woman he tried to frame." Vess's permanently surprised expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker, gone before she could name it. "I intend to," he said, and walked away, and she stood alone in the cold corridor, with the unsettling certainty that she'd just shown her hand to someone who already knew more than he'd said. That night, Draven came to her cell himself. No guards, no pretense of summons, and stood in the doorway the way he had the first time, except now the silence between them held something that hadn't been there before. Not accusation, not distance. Something closer to a question neither of them had asked aloud yet. "I spoke to Joran's," he said. "The forger used a Korath seal cast from an old trade impression, Not the current one. Whoever made it had access to documents from before the last treaty renewal. That narrows it. It narrows it to fewer than a dozen men in this keep. His eyes found hers in the low light. Vess is one of them. I know. You knew. I suspected. He's too eager to bury the question instead of answer it. She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, the scar at her collarbone catching faint torchlight. What will you do? I don't know yet. He stepped closer, close enough now that the cedar and iron scent of him filled the small cell entirely, close enough that she felt the warmth radiating off him, though they weren't touching. I know what I want to do. Which is, tell the entire court the truth, all of it, the forged seal, the bond. Let them see exactly what I am and decide whether they still want me on that chair. His hand lifted, slow, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, the touch so light it might have been accidental, except his hand lingered a half-second longer than accident allowed. I'm done deciding for you what you can survive. Her breath caught. The cell was so quiet she could hear the torch guttering down the corridor, the drip of water somewhere far below. That's not your decision to make alone either, she said, voice rougher than she meant it to be. No, he agreed. It isn't. Neither of them moved away. For a long moment they simply stood there, an inch of cold air between them and 6 years of distance, finally, dangerously, beginning to close. Then he stepped back, pulled his hand away first this time. Not like this, he said. Not in a cell, with you still condemned. When I claim what's between us, it will be in front of the people who tried to take you from me. Not hidden in the dark like something shameful. He left before she could answer. She sat alone afterward, fingers pressed to the spot on her face his hand had touched, and understood that whatever was building between them had just crossed a line neither of them could pretend hadn't happened. The break came on the 11th day, and it came from the gap-toothed guard. The one who'd handed her the forged letter at the start of all this, the same missing front tooth, except now his hands shook where hers never had, and he came to Joran in the dead of night asking to confess before his conscience did something worse than confessing ever could. Vess paid me, he said, sitting in the war room with his hands clasped tight enough to whiten the knuckles. Told me to plant the letter, told me it was for the good of the pack, that the woman was already compromised by her closeness to the king, that someone needed to force the matter before it festered into something that cost lives. Why now? Draven said, low, dangerous. Why confess now? The guard's throat worked. Because I heard he's sending word to the Korath envoys tonight. Telling them the king's bond to her proves everything he warned them about. Telling them to demand her execution themselves, so it's not the king's hand that has to do it twice. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. He's not protecting the pack, Rosalind said slowly, from where she stood near the door, having been summoned the moment the guard's confession started. He's protecting whatever he gets from a war with Korath. Land. Position. Something. Both, Joran said grimly. Vess's holdings border the Korath line. A war redraws those borders in his favor. Draven's hands had gone white-knuckled on the table edge, the same stillness Rosalind recognized from the moment before the axe had nearly fallen. Not calm. Control stretched to its absolute limit. Bring him to the hall, he said. Now, before that message reaches the envoys, the long hall filled faster than Rosalind had ever seen it fill. Summoned at an hour when nothing good ever happened, torches guttering against stone walls, the cold pressing in through windows that hadn't been shuttered in time. Sela Korath stood near the dais, arms crossed, her white-streaked hair catching torchlight, waiting to see what kind of king she'd actually ridden 2 days to meet. Vess was brought in flanked by guards, his absent eyebrow lending him that same expression of permanent mild surprise even now. Even with the gap-toothed guard, standing pale and shaking near the front of the hall, even with the truth already loose in the room before a single accusation had been spoken aloud. Lord Vess, Draven said, and his voice carried to every corner without rising. You forged a Korath seal using documents accessible to fewer than a dozen men in this keep. You paid a guard to plant false evidence against a woman who has served this pack faithfully for 6 years. And tonight, you intended to send word inviting our allies to demand a second execution, so that her death would not have to be ordered twice by the same hand. The hall held its breath. I did what was necessary, Vess said, and for the first time his careful composure cracked, something genuinely surprised finally matching the permanent shape of his face. Your bond to her was always going to compromise this pack's judgment. I simply moved the timeline forward. If you'd executed her cleanly the first time, none of this. You sentenced an innocent woman to die, Rosalind said, stepping forward before anyone could stop her. To protect your border holdings, don't dress it as loyalty. For one moment, something almost human crossed Vess's face, not regret, not quite. But something closer to a man realizing the floor beneath his careful plan had given out entirely, that the surprise his face always wore had finally caught up to something real. I have served this pack 30 years, he said, quieter now. I did not enjoy what I did to you. I want that understood. I believed it was the lesser cost. It wasn't yours to weigh, Draven said. It was never yours to weigh. He turned then to Sela Korath, who had watched the entire exchange without a single word. Your envoys came expecting closure, he said. Here it is. The forger stands before you. The woman he tried to destroy stands beside me. I will not pretend the bond between us doesn't exist. Not anymore. Not to you. Not to this hall. Not to anyone who still wants to question my judgment because of it. But the judgment that nearly killed her wasn't born of the bond. It was born of cowardice. Mine, in not speaking sooner, and his in exploiting the silence I left behind. The hall had gone utterly still. What I do next, Draven said. I do because it's true, not because it's convenient. Rosalind is my mate. I claim her here, in front of the men who tried to take her from me, and in front of the woman I almost let an axe fall on rather than say so. The words landed like a second blade. Not on her this time, but through the entire room, and Rosalind felt every eye shift to her at once, the weight of it heavier than the axe had ever been, because the axe had only threatened her body. This threatened everything she'd built to survive without needing anyone at all. She did not move toward him. Not yet. You don't get to do this, she said, and her voice cut clean through the hall's stunned silence, as an apology. Draven turned to her fully now, the court forgotten at the edges of his vision. It's not an apology. It sounds like one. Convenient timing, in front of the people who need to see your judgment redeemed. Then let it sound however it sounds. He stepped closer, close enough that Sela Korath and Vess, and the entire watching hall faded into something distant and unimportant. I'm not claiming you to fix what they think of me. I'm claiming you because I have spent 11 days lying to a court, to myself, and worst of all to you, about what I felt the moment that blade came down. I won't lie about it anymore. Whether you accept it is yours to decide. Whether I say it out loud is mine. The hall waited. Sela waited, arms still crossed, dark eyes moving between them with an interest that had nothing to do with politics anymore. Vess waited too, his guard's hands firm on his arms. His fate already sealed, and somehow less interesting to him in this moment than watching whether the king's gamble would hold. Rosalind's pulse beat hard enough that she felt it in the old fishhook scar at her collarbone, an ache that had nothing to do with cold. The bond doesn't get to choose for me, she said. I know. I won't be claimed because your wolf made a decision before you did. I know that too. His hand lifted, not quite touching her, hovering the way it had in the cell, asking permission this time instead of taking it. That's not what I'm asking. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to choose me, he said, quiet enough that only she truly heard it, though the hall strained to. Not the bond. Not the crown. Me. Knowing exactly what I am. A man who let his silence cost you 11 days of danger, who has a wolf that decided for him once and might never have spoken the truth without it. I'm not offering you a king who deserves you. I'm offering you a man who's done hiding. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the hall's held breath turned audible, long enough that Selakorath's expression shifted from curiosity into something almost like respect. You ordered my execution, Rosalind said, and her voice didn't break, not once, not even here. I need you to live with that, not apologize it away, not let a bond paper over it. Live with it, the way I have to live with 11 days in a cell, wondering if the next knock at my door was a guard or an assassin. I will, Dravan said, every day. Then say it without the bond as your excuse. He didn't hesitate this time. I love you. Not because some ancient instinct decided it before I could. I loved you the 3rd year. You stayed past your dismissal hour, translating border disputes nobody else could parse. And I told myself it was nothing, and I was wrong every single day since. The hall had gone so silent Rosalind could hear the torches burning. She closed the last distance between them herself, her choice, her feet. Not the axe, not the bond, not the court's expectation. Her own decision, the same stillness in her hands that had unsettled the crowd at the block, now steadying something far gentler. Then I choose you, she said. Not the crown, not the bond. You, knowing exactly what you are. His hand finally closed over hers, and the touch held none of the desperation of the cell, none of the fear of the platform. It held something quieter, something earned. Vess was stripped of title and lands before the dawn, his holdings reassigned to the crown pending a full accounting, and the gap-toothed guard who'd confessed was spared the worst of judgment for the courage it had cost him to come forward. Selakorath stayed 3 more days, not out of suspicion now, but something closer to curiosity, and left with a treaty renewed on terms fairer than the ones that had brought her riding in expecting a corpse. Rosalind walked through the keep in the weeks after as a free woman for the first time in a month, and the strangest part wasn't the absence of guards at her door. It was the absence of the old habit, counting footsteps, counting drops of water, counting anything that would keep panic at bay. She found she didn't need to count anymore. The stillness in her hands had finally stopped being armor and started, slowly, becoming something closer to peace. She and Dravan did not rush what came after. The bond remained, an undeniable thread between them neither could fully unmake, but they built around it deliberately, the way you'd build a house around a tree too old to cut down, accommodating it, but never letting it be the only reason the structure stood. He asked her opinion on treaties before signing them. She told him, more than once, exactly what she thought of decisions she didn't agree with, and he listened. Every time the way a man listens when he's finally decided, a silence has cost him enough. On a morning months later, frost still thick on the same courtyard stones where the block had once stood empty, Rosalind walked out to find the platform gone entirely, dismantled at Dravan's order the week after Vess's fall, the wood repurposed into something he'd never told her the use of until she saw it herself. A long table, set beneath bare winter trees, where the court now took its meals in the cold morning air instead of conducting its cruelties. He was already there when she arrived, his split palm long since healed but the scar still visible, a thin pale line where the blade had nearly taken more than just her life. You kept it, she said, running her fingers along the table's worn grain. I didn't want to forget what almost happened. He took her hand, no urgency in it now, only certainty. I wanted somewhere we'd sit and remember, every single day, exactly how close I came to losing you to my own silence. She laced her fingers through his, the cold morning settling around them both, ordinary and unremarkable, and entirely hers to keep. Good, she said. Don't ever stop remembering. The frost held on the stones a little longer than usual that year, hard and bright under the rising sun, and somewhere beneath it, the ground that had once waited for a killing blow now held nothing but 2 sets of footprints, walking the same direction, neither one ahead of the other.